A land before a nation, indigenous civilizations and the first shadows of change. Long before the word America was spoken, before maps drew borders and flags claimed land, an entire world already existed across the vast continent. This world was not empty, wild, or waiting to be discovered. It was alive with nations, traditions, and civilizations that had developed over thousands of years. From the frozen Arctic to the humid forests of the Southeast, from the Great Plains to the Pacific Coast, indigenous peoples shaped the land and were shaped by it in ways that defined pre-colonial America. These societies were deeply connected to nature, not as conquerors, but as caretakers. Rivers were not merely sources of water, they were living beings. Forests were not obstacles, they were homes and spiritual spaces. Mountains, animals, and the sky itself carried meaning. Life moved in cycles, of seasons, of birth and death, of renewal. This worldview would later stand in sharp contrast to the ideas brought by Europeans who saw land as something to be owned, divided, and exploited. Across the continent, indigenous civilizations varied greatly in structure and complexity. In the Southwest, the ancestral Pueblo peoples built stone cities carved into cliffs and canyons, designing advanced irrigation systems to survive the harsh desert climate. Their architecture reflected both practicality and spirituality, aligned with celestial movements and seasonal changes. Far to the east, the Mississippian culture flourished along major rivers, constructing massive earthen mounds that served as ceremonial, political, and social centers. Cahokia, near present-day Illinois, became one of the largest cities in North America long before European capitals rose to prominence. In the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often known as the Iroquois League, developed one of the most sophisticated systems of governance on the continent. Composed of several nations united under the Great Law of Peace, their confederation emphasized balance, collective decision-making, and accountability of leaders. Power was not concentrated in a single ruler, but distributed through councils, with women playing crucial roles in leadership and succession. This model of governance would later draw the curiosity of European thinkers, some of whom quietly admired its stability and democratic principles. Spiritual life was woven into every aspect of indigenous existence. There was no separation between religion and daily living. Ceremonies marked harvests, births, and transitions into adulthood. Storytelling preserved history, morals, and identity, passed orally from generation to generation. Elders were respected as living libraries, carrying wisdom shaped by time and experience. Dreams, visions, and rituals connected individuals to the spirit world, reinforcing the belief that humans were only one part of a much larger cosmic order. Trade networks stretched across thousands of miles, long before European ships crossed the Atlantic. Copper from the Great Lakes traveled south, shells from coastal regions moved inland, and obsidian from the west appeared in distant settlements. These trade routes did more than exchange goods. They shared ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Contrary to later myths, indigenous America was not isolated or primitive. It was dynamic, adaptive, and interconnected. When the Old World arrived, exploration, greed, and broken promises. The arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century marked a turning point not only for the Americas, but for the entire world. What began as curiosity and ambition quickly unfolded into conquest, exploitation, and irreversible change. To Europeans, the lands across the Atlantic appeared new and mysterious. To the people who already lived there, the arrival of foreign ships signaled the beginning of an age defined by uncertainty, loss, and broken promises. Europe at the time was driven by competition and hunger for power. Kingdoms sought new trade routes, precious metals, and territorial expansion. The fall of Constantinople had disrupted access to Asian markets, forcing European powers to look westward. Religion also played a central role, as monarchs and explorers believed it was their divine mission to spread Christianity to unknown lands. These motives, wealth, power, and faith, merged into a single force that pushed ships into uncharted waters. In 1492, Christopher Columbus set sail under the Spanish crown, seeking a western route to Asia. Instead, he reached islands in the Caribbean, unknowingly stepping into a world that had existed for thousands of years. Columbus described the land as fertile and the people as peaceful, yet his writings revealed something more troubling. He saw opportunity not only in the land, but in the people themselves, laborers, converts, and subjects to be claimed in the name of empire. Initial encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples were often marked by curiosity on both sides. Indigenous communities offered food, guidance, and hospitality, viewing the newcomers as guests rather than conquerors. Europeans, however, interpreted kindness as weakness. What began as exchange soon turned into dominance. Spanish expeditions demanded gold, imposed forced labor, and introduced systems of control that shattered local societies. The consequences were devastating. Disease swept through the Caribbean and mainland Americas at a scale never seen before. Smallpox alone killed millions, collapsing entire civilizations within decades. Villages stood silent, fields lay abandoned, and cultural knowledge vanished with those who carried it. To European observers, this decline was seen as proof of divine favor, reinforcing the belief that conquest was justified and inevitable. As Spain expanded its reach, other European powers followed. Portugal, France, England, and the Netherlands entered the race for territory and influence. Each empire brought its own methods of colonization, but all shared a common goal: extraction of wealth. Land was surveyed, claimed, and renamed. Borders were drawn without regard for existing nations or cultures. The concept of ownership replaced the indigenous understanding of shared stewardship. In North America, early English settlements struggled to survive. Jamestown, founded in 1607, faced starvation, disease, and internal conflict. Survival depended heavily on indigenous assistance, particularly from the Powhatan Confederacy. Yet this reliance did not foster respect. Instead, it created tension, suspicion, and eventually violence. Agreements were made and broken, often deliberately, as settlers demanded more land and resources. Misunderstandings between cultures deepened these conflicts. Indigenous diplomacy emphasized long-term relationships and mutual obligation. European treaties, however, were written documents, often manipulated to favor colonial interests. Where indigenous leaders saw alliances, Europeans saw legal ownership. Language barriers and differing worldviews ensured that even peaceful negotiations carried the seeds of future betrayal. Religion further complicated these encounters. Missionaries arrived with the goal of conversion, believing indigenous spiritual practices to be inferior or sinful. Churches were built on sacred ground, and traditional ceremonies were suppressed. For many indigenous communities, conversion was less about faith and more about survival, an attempt to coexist in a world rapidly changing beyond their control. Despite growing tension, resistance never ceased. Indigenous nations fought to protect their land and sovereignty. From the Caribbean uprisings against Spanish rule to coordinated resistance in North America, native leaders challenged European expansion with strategy and courage.
Yet European military technology, combined with disease and relentless immigration, gradually tipped the balance. Colonial competition also fueled conflict among Europeans themselves. Wars fought in Europe spilled into the Americas, turning indigenous lands into battlegrounds for foreign empires. Alliances shifted, loyalties were tested, and indigenous nations were often forced to choose sides in conflicts that were never truly theirs. These choices carried lasting consequences, shaping the political landscape of the continent. Perhaps the most tragic element of this era was the erosion of trust. Early encounters held the possibility of coexistence. Trade, shared knowledge, and mutual respect could have defined a different future. Instead, greed overshadowed understanding. Promises of peace were followed by land seizures. Words of friendship were erased by the sound of muskets and marching boots. By the early 16th century, the foundations of colonial America were firmly set. European settlements expanded, indigenous populations declined, and systems of inequality became deeply rooted. Slavery began to take hold, replacing indigenous labor with enslaved Africans, adding another layer of human suffering to an already violent transformation. The Old World had arrived, but it did not come as a guest. It came as a force that reshaped everything in its path. The legacy of exploration is often told as a story of bravery and discovery. Yet beneath that narrative lies a more complex truth, one marked by ambition without restraint, faith without humility, and progress built on broken promises. Understanding this chapter of history requires looking beyond heroic myths and confronting uncomfortable realities. The arrival of Europeans was not the beginning of America, but it was the beginning of a struggle between worlds, values, and visions of the future. A struggle whose consequences are still felt today, in the land, in the laws, and in the voices demanding that history be remembered in full.
Chains and colonies, the birth of an unequal society. As European colonies took root across the Americas, a new society began to form, one built on ambition, survival, and profit. Beneath the language of progress and civilization, however, lay a darker foundation. The colonial economy demanded labor on a massive scale, and when voluntary labor proved insufficient, coercion replaced consent. From this need emerged a system that would shape the future of America more deeply than any single law or battle: slavery. In the early years of colonization, European settlers relied on a mixture of indigenous labor, indentured servants from Europe, and small-scale farming. Indigenous people were often forced into labor through violence or manipulated agreements, but disease and resistance made this system unstable. Indentured servants, mostly poor Europeans, worked under contracts that promised freedom after several years. Yet as plantations expanded and profits grew, colonial leaders sought a labor force that could be controlled permanently. The answer came across the Atlantic in chains. The transatlantic slave trade was not an accidental byproduct of colonization. It was a deliberate economic strategy. European merchants, African traders, and colonial planters formed a brutal network that treated human beings as commodities. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and transported across the ocean in conditions so inhumane that survival itself was uncertain. The Middle Passage, as it came to be known, claimed countless lives before the enslaved ever reached land. Those who survived arrived in a world designed to erase their humanity. Enslaved Africans were stripped of their names, languages, and identities. Families were separated without warning. Laws defined them not as people, but as property, assets that could be bought, sold, or destroyed. Violence was not a failure of the system, it was the system. Whippings, branding, and psychological terror enforced obedience and crushed resistance. Economically, slavery transformed the colonies.
Plantation agriculture, especially tobacco, sugar, rice, and later cotton, generated enormous wealth. This wealth fueled the rise of colonial cities, financed European empires, and laid the groundwork for global capitalism. Ports thrived, banks expanded, and industries grew, all connected to the labor of the enslaved. The colony's prosperity was inseparable from suffering, yet this reality was rarely acknowledged by those who benefited. To justify such cruelty, colonists constructed a racial hierarchy that placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. Race became a tool of power, reinforcing inequality through law, culture, and belief. Pseudo-scientific theories claimed Africans were naturally inferior, suited only for labor. Religion was twisted to support oppression, with selective interpretations of Scripture used to portray slavery as divinely sanctioned. This racial system did more than control the enslaved, it also divided the poor. European laborers, though exploited, were gradually granted privileges based on skin color. These privileges created a sense of superiority that discouraged unity between oppressed groups. In this way, race became a weapon that protected elite interests while ensuring the continuation of inequality. Yet even within this oppressive system, resistance never disappeared. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, through work slowdowns, sabotage, preserving cultural traditions, and at times open rebellion. They told stories, sang songs, and practiced faith as acts of survival and defiance. Some escaped, forming maroon communities beyond colonial control. Their resistance challenged the lie that slavery was accepted or natural. At the same time, colonists spoke increasingly of liberty and freedom. They praised individual rights, property, and self-governance, especially resisting control from distant European monarchs. These ideals would later form the foundation of American political identity. Yet the contradiction was glaring. How could a society that celebrated freedom justify human bondage? How could men who demanded liberty deny it to others? Many colonial leaders were fully aware of this hypocrisy. Some expressed moral discomfort, while others argued that slavery was a necessary evil. Economic dependence made true reform unthinkable. The system was too profitable, too deeply embedded in colonial life. Moral concern was often sacrificed to convenience, and ideals bent under the weight of wealth. Slavery also reshaped colonial law. Slave codes were established to control every aspect of enslaved life: movement, marriage, education, and punishment. These laws reinforced racial boundaries and normalized violence. Over time, they hardened into a legal framework that defined freedom itself as something reserved for white Europeans. This legal inequality would echo through generations. Forced labor extended beyond African slavery. Indigenous people continued to suffer displacement, enslavement, and exploitation. Land was seized, treaties ignored, and communities pushed aside to make room for plantations and settlements. Colonial expansion thrived on the removal of those who stood in its way, whether through chains or conquest. By the early 18th century, an unequal society had fully emerged. Wealth and power concentrated in the hands of a few, while millions lived without rights or protection. The colonies were growing stronger, richer, and more confident, but also more divided. The promise of freedom existed alongside its denial, creating a tension that would later erupt into conflict. The birth of America was not only a story of independence and ideals, it was also a story of exclusion and exploitation. Chains and colonies were intertwined, shaping a nation that would struggle to reconcile its values with its actions. Understanding this history is essential, not to assign blame alone, but to recognize how deeply inequality is woven into the fabric of society. The foundations of freedom were laid with contradictions beneath them, and as the colonies moved closer to revolution, the question remained unanswered. Could a nation built on inequality ever truly be free?
Faith, Fear and fire, religion's power over early America. In the early centuries of American colonization, religion was not merely a matter of private belief. It was the foundation of law, the justification of authority, and the lens through which life itself was understood. Faith offered hope to those crossing a dangerous ocean, but it also carried fear of sin, fear of divine punishment, and fear of difference. Together, faith and fear shaped the moral and political structure of early America, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the flames of persecution had faded. Many of the earliest European settlers came not only in search of land or wealth, but in pursuit of religious freedom. In England and parts of Europe, religious conformity was enforced by the state, and dissenters faced imprisonment, exile, or worse. Among these dissenters were the Puritans, a group who sought to purify the Church of England from what they viewed as corruption. For them, the New World represented a divine opportunity, a place where they could build a godly society according to their own interpretation of Scripture. When the Puritans arrived in New England in the early 17th century, they believed they were chosen for a sacred mission. Their leader, John Winthrop, famously described the colony as a city upon a hill, watched by the world and judged by God. This belief gave the community a powerful sense of purpose, but it also demanded strict obedience. To fail spiritually was not just a personal matter, it threatened the survival of the entire society. Puritan communities were tightly controlled. Church attendance was mandatory, and laws reflected religious doctrine. Moral behavior was regulated through public punishment, fines, and social shaming. Acts considered sinful, such as adultery, drunkenness, or even questioning authority, were treated as crimes against God and the community. The line between religious belief and civil law disappeared, creating a society where faith governed every aspect of life. Ironically, the same people who fled persecution in Europe often became persecutors themselves. Religious tolerance had limits, and those who challenged Puritan beliefs faced exile or punishment. Figures like Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson were banished for advocating religious freedom and questioning church authority. Their banishment revealed a deep contradiction. The desire for freedom applied only to those who believed the right way. Fear played a central role in maintaining social order. The Puritans believed the world was a battleground between God and Satan, and that the devil was actively working to corrupt their community. This belief created an atmosphere of constant suspicion. Misfortune, crop failure, illness, or sudden death was often interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure or demonic influence. Nowhere was this fear more destructive during the Salem witch trials of 1692. What began as strange behavior among a group of young girls quickly escalated into mass hysteria. Accusations spread rapidly, fueled by personal grudges, religious anxiety, and social tensions. Evidence was based on visions, dreams, and hearsay, what was called spectral evidence. Reason gave way to terror. In a matter of months, dozens were accused of witchcraft. 19 people were executed, and many more imprisoned. The trials revealed how easily fear could override justice when belief was weaponized. The accused were often outsiders, women, the poor, or those who challenged traditional roles. The witch trials were not simply a religious event, they were a reflection of social control, where conformity meant survival. Religion also shaped early American identity in quieter but equally powerful ways. Education was rooted in religious instruction, with schools established to ensure that children could read the Bible. Literacy became a moral duty. Community life revolved around the church, reinforcing shared values and collective discipline. Over time, these practices fostered a strong sense of communal responsibility and moral seriousness that would influence American culture for generations. Yet religious influence was not uniform across the colonies.
While New England was dominated by Puritan ideals, other regions experienced different expressions of faith. In Pennsylvania, founded by the Quakers, religious tolerance was more deeply practiced. Quakers rejected violence, emphasized equality, and welcomed diverse beliefs. Their colony stood as an alternative model, proving that faith could coexist with freedom. Despite these differences, religion remained a powerful force everywhere. Laws regulating marriage, inheritance, and public behavior were often rooted in religious belief. Concepts of sin and virtue shaped legal systems and social expectations. Even those who were not deeply religious lived under its influence, as faith defined what was acceptable, moral, or dangerous. Religion also intersected with issues of race and slavery. Many enslavers used religious arguments to justify human bondage, claiming it was part of a divine plan. At the same time, enslaved people adapted Christian teachings to express hope, resistance, and a belief in justice beyond earthly systems. Over time, the strict religious authority of early colonies began to weaken. Economic growth, increased diversity, and the influence of the Enlightenment ideas challenged the dominance of religious rule. The memory of persecution, particularly the witch trials, left lasting scars and raised questions about the dangers of mixing faith with unchecked power. By the early 18th century, the colonies stood at a crossroads. Religion still shaped identity and values, but cracks had appeared in its control over law and society. These cracks would later widen, paving the way for new ideas about individual rights, freedom of conscience, and the separation of church and state. The story of faith in early America is not of pure devotion or pure cruelty. It is a story of hope and fear, belief and control, light and fire. Religion gave meaning to a dangerous new world, but when fused with power and fear, it also justified injustice. To understand America's beginnings, one must understand how belief shaped not only souls, but laws, identities, and the fragile line between righteousness and tyranny.
Seeds of rebellion, taxes, tyranny, and the rise of resistance. By the mid-18th century, the American colonies stood at a critical turning point. What had once been distant outposts of the British Empire had grown into thriving societies with their own economies, identities, and expectations. For generations, colonists had lived under British rule with relative independence, governing their local affairs while remaining loyal to the crown. Yet beneath this surface of stability, resentment was quietly taking root. The seeds of rebellion were being planted, nourished by taxes, tyranny, and a growing belief that freedom should not be negotiated but claimed. The end of the French and Indian War in 1763 marked a dramatic shift in Britain's relationship with its colonies. Though the war had secured British dominance in North America, it left the empire burdened with enormous debt. British leaders looked across the Atlantic and saw the colonies not as partners, but as sources of revenue. Parliament believed it was reasonable for colonists to help pay for the war that had been fought, in part to protect them. The colonists saw it differently. For decades, they had governed themselves through local assemblies and elected representatives. While they considered themselves British subjects, they believed their rights were equal to those of citizens in England. Chief among those rights was the belief that taxes could only be imposed by representatives chosen by the people. When Parliament began passing tax laws without colonial consent, it struck at the heart of colonial identity. The first major flashpoint came with the Stamp Act of 1765. For the first time, Britain imposed a direct tax on the colonies, requiring official stamps on newspapers, legal documents, and everyday items. The reaction was swift and explosive. Colonists from all social classes saw the tax as an attack on liberty.
Merchants organized boycotts, crowds filled the streets in protest, and colonial assemblies issued formal objections. From this resistance emerged a powerful slogan: "No taxation without representation." It was more than a protest against money, it was a declaration of political principle. Colonists argued that laws made an ocean away by men they had never elected were illegitimate. In taverns, newspapers, and public meetings, ideas about rights and governance spread rapidly. Groups such as the Sons of Liberty took resistance further. Using both persuasion and intimidation, they pressured tax collectors to resign and ensured that British laws were unenforceable. Effigies were burned, symbols of authority destroyed, and crowds made it clear that compliance would come at a cost. While some colonists worried about chaos, others saw resistance as a necessary defense against tyranny. Britain responded by repealing the Stamp Act, but the victory was incomplete. Parliament soon passed new laws asserting its authority to tax and govern the colonies. The Townshend Acts placed duties on imported goods like tea, glass, and paper, reigniting colonial anger. Boycotts returned, and colonial women played a crucial role, organizing efforts to produce homemade goods and reduce dependence on British imports. Tensions escalated further with the presence of British troops in colonial cities. In Boston, soldiers were stationed to enforce laws and maintain order, but their presence only deepened hostility. Competition for jobs, cultural differences, and mutual distrust created a volatile atmosphere. In 1770, this tension exploded in the Boston Massacre, when British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. Though the incident involved chaos and confusion, colonial leaders seized the moment. Newspapers and pamphlets portrayed the event as a brutal act of oppression, fueling public outrage. The victims were transformed into martyrs for the cause of liberty, and the divide between Britain and the colonies grew wider. The most iconic act of resistance came in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party. When Parliament granted the British East India Company a monopoly on tea in the colonies, colonists viewed it as another attempt to force them into submission. Under the cover of night, colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water. The message was unmistakable. The colonies would not accept unjust authority. Britain's response was swift and severe. The coercive acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, punished Massachusetts by closing Boston's port, limiting self-government, and increasing military control. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, these measures united the colonies in shared outrage. For the first time, colonial resistance began to transform into colonial unity. Committees of correspondence connected distant towns and colonies, sharing news and coordinating action. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies gathered at the First Continental Congress. Though they still hoped for reconciliation, they stood together in defense of their rights. This unity was fragile and incomplete. Many colonists remained loyal to the crown, fearing rebellion would bring chaos and ruin. Others sought compromise rather than independence. Yet the language of resistance had changed. Colonists no longer spoke only of taxes, but of natural rights, liberty, and self-determination. What made this moment revolutionary was not just defiance, but identity. Colonists began to see themselves as something new, not merely British subjects, but Americans. Shared grievances created shared purpose. Resistance became a common cause, bridging differences in region, class, and belief. The seeds of rebellion had been planted slowly, watered by years of frustration and betrayal. By the early 1770s, they had taken root across the colonies. What began as protests against taxation evolved into a challenge against imperial authority itself. The road ahead would lead to war, sacrifice, and uncertainty, but the path toward revolution had already been chosen. The question was no longer whether the colonies would resist, but how far they were willing to defend the idea that freedom belonged to those bold enough to demand it.
The war no one expected to win. Revolution against an empire. When the first shots of the American Revolutionary War were fired in 1775, few believed the colonies stood a real chance of victory. Facing them was the British Empire, the most powerful military force in the world, with a professional army, a dominant navy, and vast global resources. The colonists, by contrast, were divided, poorly equipped, and inexperienced in large-scale warfare. What they did possess, however, was a determination born from years of resistance and the growing belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The conflict began in the towns of Lexington and Concord, where British troops marched to seize colonial weapons and arrest rebel leaders. Local militias, often made up of farmers and tradesmen, stood in their path. The exchange of gunfire was brief but historic, signaling that political resistance had turned into armed rebellion. As news spread, thousands of volunteers took up arms, surrounding British forces in Boston and transforming protest into revolution. Early battles revealed both the courage and the weakness of the colonial cause. Militias lacked discipline and supplies, and many soldiers enlisted only for short periods. Yet they also displayed resilience, fighting with knowledge of the land and a fierce commitment to their homes and families. In June 1775, colonial forces confronted British forces at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Though the British ultimately claimed the ground, their heavy losses shocked the empire and proved that the rebels could stand against trained soldiers. Leadership would soon determine whether resistance would survive or collapse. In 1775, the Continental Congress appointed George Washington as commander of the Continental Army. Washington was not chosen for brilliance alone, but for his character and ability to unite the colonies. Tall, reserved, and disciplined, he understood that victory would not come from decisive battles alone, but from endurance. Washington faced enormous challenges. His army was often underpaid, underfed, and poorly clothed. Desertion was common, morale fragile. Disease killed more soldiers than combat. Supplies were scarce, and political interference complicated command. Yet Washington maintained a sense of purpose, reminding his troops that they fought not as subjects, but as citizens defending a cause greater than themselves. In 1776, the colonies took a decisive step by declaring independence. The Declaration of Independence transformed the war from a rebellion into a fight for nationhood. It inspired soldiers and civilians alike, but it also raised the stakes. There would be no return to British rule. Victory or ruin lay ahead. The early years of the war were grim. British forces captured New York, delivering a crushing blow to the Continental Army. Washington was forced into retreat, narrowly escaping destruction. Many believed the revolution was nearing its end. Yet, in the darkest moment, Washington made a bold move. On a cold Christmas night in 1776, he led his troops across the icy Delaware River to launch a surprise attack on Hessian forces at Trenton. The victory was small in scale, but enormous in impact, restoring hope and proving that the revolution still lived. The war dragged on, testing endurance on both sides. In 1777, a turning point came at the Battle of Saratoga. American forces defeated a British army, convincing France that the colonies had a real chance of winning. France's entry into the war changed everything.
With French military support, financial aid, and naval power, the balance began to shift. What had been a colonial rebellion became an international conflict. France was not motivated by idealism alone. Old rivalries with Britain made American independence strategically attractive. Still, the alliance provided crucial resources and legitimacy. Other nations, including Spain and the Netherlands, offered support, further weakening Britain's global position. The sacrifices of the war were immense. Civilians suffered shortages, displacement, and violence. Families were divided between loyalists and patriots. Enslaved people faced cruel choices as both sides promised freedom in exchange for service. Native American nations were drawn into the conflict, often siding with Britain in hopes of limiting colonial expansion. For many, the war brought devastation without the promise of freedom. Washington's greatest achievement was not in battlefield brilliance, but in keeping the army together. He avoided unnecessary confrontations, striking when conditions favored him. His leadership emphasized discipline, unity, and moral authority. When officers plotted against him or questioned civilian control, he stood firm, reinforcing the idea that the military served the people, not the other way around. The End Act came in 1781 at Yorktown. Trapped by American and French forces on land and cut off by the French Navy at sea, British General Cornwallis was forced to surrender. The victory effectively ended major fighting, though peace negotiations would take years. Against all expectations, the colonies had defeated an empire. Victory did not come from superior power, but from resilience, alliances, and belief in a shared cause. The war had proven that ordinary people, united by an idea, could challenge the strongest forces of their time. Yet the end of the war did not bring immediate peace or justice. The new nation faced enormous challenges: economic instability, political division, and unresolved questions of freedom and equality. Independence was only the beginning. The war no one expected to win reshaped history. It demonstrated that power could be challenged, that empires were not invincible, and that the idea of self-rule could inspire sacrifice on a global scale. The revolution had succeeded, but the true test of its ideals was still to come.
Freedom's paradox. Independence declared, equality denied. In July of 1776, the American colonies declared themselves free. With a single document, they announced to the world that they were no longer subjects of an empire, but a people determined to govern themselves. The Declaration of Independence spoke in bold, universal language of natural rights, human equality, and liberty beyond the reach of kings. Yet even as those words were celebrated, they carried a deep and lasting contradiction. Freedom was proclaimed, but it was not shared equally. The new nation was born with a promise it could not yet keep. The Declaration of Independence was a radical statement for its time. Drawing on Enlightenment ideas, it argued that all people were endowed with unalienable rights, including life and liberty. Government, it declared, existed to protect those rights, deriving its power from the consent of the governed. When a government failed in that duty, the people had the right to change it or abolish it. These ideas challenged centuries of monarchy and divine rule, inspiring hope far beyond America's shores. For many colonists, the Declaration gave moral clarity to a long struggle. It transformed a war of resistance into a war of principles. Soldiers fought not only for independence, but for the idea that freedom belonged to ordinary people. The document united the colonies under a shared vision and announced to the world that a new political experiment was underway. But the promise of equality was incomplete from the start. The phrase, "all men are created equal," did not include everyone. Women, enslaved Africans and Native Americans were excluded by law, by custom, and by belief. The very men who wrote and signed the Declaration often owned enslaved people and upheld systems of inequality. Liberty, in practice, was narrowly defined. For enslaved people, the contradiction was immediate and brutal. As white colonists demanded freedom from British rule, millions remained in bondage. Some enslaved men and women seized the language of liberty as a weapon of their own, petitioning courts and legislatures for freedom. Others sought escape, joining the British or continental forces in hopes that service would lead to liberation. A few gained freedom, but most did not. Slavery survived the Revolution, embedded in the economic and social structure of the new nation. Women, too, were inspired by the revolutionary rhetoric, yet denied its rewards. They managed farms and businesses during the war, organized boycotts, and supported the cause in countless ways. Some, like Abigail Adams, urged leaders to remember the ladies when forming new laws. Their appeals were largely ignored. Women remained excluded from voting rights, property rights, and political power. Their contributions were praised, but their equality postponed indefinitely. For Native Americans, independence brought not liberation, but greater danger. Many indigenous nations had sided with Britain, believing it offered the best chance to limit colonial expansion. When the war ended, they were left unprotected. The new United States viewed native lands as prizes of victory, open for settlement and exploitation. Treaties were broken, boundaries ignored, and removal became policy. The language of freedom did not extend to those whose presence stood in the way of expansion. Even among white men, equality was limited. Property requirements restricted voting rights, and class divisions remained strong. The Revolution challenged aristocracy, but did not eliminate inequality. Freedom existed alongside hierarchy, shaped by race, gender, and wealth. The paradox of the Revolution lay not only in exclusion, but in justification. Many leaders recognized the hypocrisy, but argued that equality must come gradually. Others insisted that social order required limits on who could claim full rights. Economic interests, particularly slavery, made immediate change unthinkable. The ideals of the Declaration were celebrated in theory, while compromised in practice. Yet the power of those ideals should not be underestimated. The Declaration became a standard against which injustice could be measured. Its words were invoked by abolitionists, women's rights advocates, and civil rights movements in the centuries that followed. The document's strength lay not in its perfection, but in its capacity to challenge the nation to become what it claimed to be. In the years following independence, debates over freedom and equality intensified. States wrestled with the meaning of citizenship, rights, and representation. Some took small steps toward ending slavery, particularly in the North, while others expanded it. The nation moved forward unevenly, shaped by compromise and conflict. The Declaration did not resolve America's contradictions, it exposed them. It revealed a nation capable of extraordinary vision and profound limitation. Freedom was declared, but its boundaries were tightly drawn. Equality was promised, but selectively applied. Understanding this paradox is essential to understanding America itself. The Revolution created a framework of ideals that challenged power and inspired change, but it also entrenched systems of exclusion that would take generations to confront. The struggle between principle and practice became a defining feature of American history. The story of independence is not only of triumph, but of unfinished work. The Declaration opened a door, but it did not carry everyone through it. Those left behind would continue to demand the rights promised in 1776, reshaping the nation in the process. Freedom's paradox remains a central question of the American experiment. Can a nation founded on liberty
truly fulfill its promise of equality? The answer would not be found in declarations alone, but in the long and difficult journey toward justice that lay ahead.
Forging a new experiment, writing the Constitution. The victory of the American Revolution brought independence, but it did not bring unity. The 13 newly sovereign states faced enormous challenges. They were bound together loosely under the Articles of Confederation, a document that granted each state near complete autonomy while leaving the national government weak, powerless to tax, regulate trade, or enforce law. The young nation, despite its lofty ideals, teetered on the edge of disorder. From economic instability to territorial disputes, from civil unrest to foreign threats, it became clear that survival required a stronger framework of governance. In 1787, representatives from across the states convened in Philadelphia with a sense of urgency and caution. This gathering, known as the Constitutional Convention, was unprecedented. Delegates came from diverse backgrounds: wealthy landowners, lawyers, merchants, and military leaders. Some were veterans of revolution, others were intellectuals steeped in Enlightenment thought. They shared a common goal: to design a government capable of preserving liberty while ensuring order. Yet agreement was far from guaranteed. The stakes were monumental. Every decision would shape the future of the nation. Debates at the convention were intense, revealing fundamental disagreements about power, representation, and the nature of democracy itself. Small states feared domination by larger ones. Large states feared being constrained by the many tiny jurisdictions. Economically diverse regions worried that taxation and trade policies would favor their rivals. Philosophical divisions ran deep. Should power reside primarily with the states, or should a strong central government hold sway? Each proposal carried profound consequences for sovereignty, security, and liberty. One of the first major disputes was representation in the national legislature. Delegates from populous states favored the Virginia Plan, which proposed proportional representation based on population. Smaller states, fearing marginalization, supported the New Jersey Plan, advocating equal representation for all states regardless of size. The convention was at an impasse, and compromise seemed impossible. Yet, through negotiation, the Great Compromise emerged: a bicameral legislature with proportional representation in the House of Representatives and equal representation in the Senate. This agreement balanced competing interests and preserved the fragile unity of the convention itself. Slavery presented perhaps the most morally complex and contentious challenge. Southern delegates wanted enslaved people counted toward population for representation, giving their states more political power. Northern delegates objected, arguing that enslaved people were denied rights and should not be counted. The resulting 3/5 compromise, counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxation, highlighted the nation's moral contradictions. It was a pragmatic solution to a political problem, one that enshrined inequality into the Constitution, a compromise whose consequences would reverberate for generations. Federalism, the division of power between national and state governments, was another central concern. Delegates recognized the need for a strong central authority capable of managing defense, commerce, and foreign affairs. At the same time, they sought to preserve state sovereignty and prevent tyranny. The resulting system carefully delineated powers. Congress could levy taxes, regulate commerce, and declare war, while states retained control over education, local law enforcement, and property law. The Constitution created a delicate balance, intentionally designed with checks and limits to prevent the abuse of power. The structure of the executive branch prompted heated discussion. Delegates debated whether a single president or a council should wield authority, how long terms should last, and what powers the office should hold. Concerns about tyranny, informed by recent experience under King George III, led to mechanisms like separation of powers, checks and balances, and the Electoral College.
The result was a presidency with significant authority, yet constrained by legislative oversight and judicial review, a careful experiment in self-limitation. Even the judiciary was a novel idea. Delegates argued that courts must exist to interpret law independently of political influence. An independent judiciary would ensure that both states and citizens had recourse against abuse. Yet the structure, powers, and selection of judges remained contentious, reflecting deep uncertainty about how to protect liberty while maintaining order. Every decision required negotiation, persuasion, and often compromise at the expense of idealism. Ratification of the Constitution was another challenge entirely. Once drafted, the document was not automatically law. It required approval by the states. Federalists who supported a strong national government argued that unity and stability were essential. Anti-federalists feared centralized power, warning that the Constitution might replicate the tyranny they had fought to escape. Public debates, pamphlets, and newspapers became battlegrounds for ideas, illustrating the intensity of civic engagement in the new republic. Compromise remained central to acceptance. To assuage fears of an overpowered central government and to protect individual liberties, the Bill of Rights was proposed. These first 10 amendments guaranteed freedoms such as speech, assembly, religion, and due process, offering citizens explicit protections against government overreach. The promise of a Bill of Rights helped persuade hesitant states to ratify the Constitution, demonstrating once more that negotiation was essential to democracy. The Constitution was, from the outset, an experiment. It combined theory and pragmatism, idealism and compromise. It did not resolve every conflict, nor did it guarantee equality or justice. Yet it created a framework that allowed the nation to govern itself, adapt, and endure. By carefully distributing power across branches of government, balancing state and national interests, and embedding mechanisms for amendment, the framers provided a living blueprint, flexible enough to evolve with time. The Constitutional Convention revealed the fragility of democracy. It showed that freedom must be constructed deliberately, not assumed. It illustrated that governing a diverse population required negotiation, compromise, and recognition of competing interests. It also exposed limits. The rights of women, enslaved people, and Native Americans remained unaddressed, a reminder that even the most groundbreaking documents can fall short of their ideals. Yet the document's creation was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time in history, a nation codified a government designed to derive its authority from the consent of the governed. Sovereignty resided not in a monarch or a distant elite, but in the people, at least in principle. This fragile birth of democracy represented both triumph and challenge. The United States had been given the tools to pursue liberty, but whether it would do so fully remained uncertain. The Constitution also set a precedent for political culture. It encouraged debate, compromise, and public engagement. Citizens were expected to be informed, to participate, and to hold leaders accountable. This principle, government of the people, by the people, for the people, was revolutionary in its ambition. Yet its fragility was evident. The document's success depended on adherence to law, respect for institutions, and a willingness to resolve conflict peacefully. In the end, the writing of the Constitution was an extraordinary achievement of vision, intellect, and diplomacy. Delegates with divergent interests, personal rivalries, and differing philosophies produced a single document capable of uniting a fractured nation. Their work reflected both idealism and realism, acknowledging human imperfection while striving to create a system that could endure. The Constitution was not the final word on freedom or equality. It was the beginning of a long experiment. It combined theory and pragmatism, idealism and compromise. It did not resolve every conflict, nor did it guarantee equality or justice. Yet it created a framework that allowed the nation to govern itself, adapt, and endure. By carefully distributing power across branches of government, balancing state and national interests, and embedding mechanisms for amendment, the framers provided a living blueprint, flexible enough to evolve with time. The Constitutional Convention revealed the fragility of democracy. It showed that freedom must be constructed deliberately, not assumed. It illustrated that governing a diverse population required negotiation, compromise, and recognition of competing interests. It also exposed limits. The rights of women, enslaved people, and Native Americans remained unaddressed, a reminder that even the most groundbreaking documents can fall short of their ideals. Yet the document's creation was nothing short of revolutionary. For the first time in history, a nation codified a government designed to derive its authority from the consent of the governed. Sovereignty resided not in a monarch or a distant elite, but in the people, at least in principle. This fragile birth of democracy represented both triumph and challenge. The United States had been given the tools to pursue
expansion, conflict, and the price of destiny. By the early 19th century, the United States had survived revolution, established a constitution, and weathered the fragile beginnings of democracy. Yet the young nation hungered for more land, more opportunity, and a sense of purpose that stretched beyond its original 13 states. This hunger was not merely economic, it was ideological, infused with the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent. This idea, later termed manifest destiny, framed westward expansion as both inevitable and divinely sanctioned. Yet the pursuit of destiny came at a profound human cost. The Louisiana Purchase of 1803 marked the first major leap westward, doubling the nation's size overnight. Vast territories, rich in resources and untamed wilderness, beckoned settlers. For Americans, the land represented freedom, opportunity, and a chance to build communities according to their vision. Farmers, traders, and families traveled westward in search of new lives, carrying dreams as large as the open skies. But this expansion was not a blank slate. Indigenous nations had inhabited these lands for centuries with complex social structures, trade networks, and cultural traditions. For them, the arrival of settlers was an existential threat. The United States government, often indifferent or hostile, negotiated treaties that were frequently broken. Native Americans were forcibly removed, lands seized, and communities fractured. Policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830 formalized what had been happening on the frontier for decades, displacement and suffering on a massive scale. The Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee and other nations were forced to march west under brutal conditions, remains a stark reminder of the moral cost of expansion. As Americans moved westward, conflicts multiplied. Settlers clashed with native tribes, sometimes through negotiation, often through violence. Skirmishes erupted over hunting grounds, rivers, and sacred sites. The military was deployed repeatedly, enforcing treaties that served U.S. interests while undermining indigenous sovereignty. Cities and towns expanded, railroads cut through forests and plains, and the very geography of the continent was reshaped to suit colonial settlement. Manifest destiny also became a rallying cry for territorial ambition. Politicians and newspapers promoted the idea that expansion was not just desirable, but morally righteous. The nation's mission, they argued, was to spread democracy and civilization from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Yet this ideology masked contradictions. It justified conquest, displacement, and war, framing the suffering of others as part of the nation's destiny. Native Americans, Mexicans, and others were cast as obstacles to progress rather than people with rights and claims. The annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico in 1846 to 48 were direct consequences of this ideology.
Texan settlers, many of whom had moved into Mexican territory illegally, rebelled and declared independence. The United States, driven by expansionist ambition, eventually annexed Texas, sparking a war with Mexico. The conflict produced significant territorial gains for the U.S., including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, and more. Yet the conquest was bloody, displacing communities, taking lives, and sowing long-term resentment. Westward expansion also intensified internal divisions, particularly over slavery. As new territories were acquired, the question of whether slavery would be permitted ignited fierce debate. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850, and later the Kansas-Nebraska Act were attempts to balance the competing interests of free and slave states. Each compromise postponed the inevitable clash, but also deepened sectional tensions as Americans realized that expansion carried moral as well as political consequences. The push for land revealed the nation's underlying contradictions. The same society that celebrated freedom simultaneously relied on the denial of liberty for millions. Economic motives drove expansion alongside ideology. Settlers sought fertile farmland, gold, timber, and trade opportunities. Railroads, canals, and eventually telegraph lines transformed distant territories into connected markets. Yet prosperity for settlers often meant devastation for others. Native communities were stripped of their resources, enslaved labor expanded in the South, and Mexican landowners lost property and influence. Every gain for one group carried a loss for another. Cultural transformation accompanied territorial growth. New towns and cities adopted American political and social norms, often erasing the presence and history of those who had lived there for generations. Schools, churches, and courts spread the ideals of American governance, but often only for settlers. Indigenous knowledge, languages, and traditions were marginalized or destroyed. Expansion was thus not only geographic, but cultural, a redefinition of the continent's identity. Yet expansion also inspired imagination, resilience, and innovation. The frontier demanded resourcefulness. Communities adapted to new climates and terrains. Settlers built homes, farms, and trade networks under harsh conditions. Exploration and scientific study flourished, mapping rivers, mountains, and plains. Writers, painters, and thinkers drew inspiration from the vast landscapes, crafting a national identity intertwined with the land itself. Despite these achievements, the moral cost was inescapable. The displacement of Native Americans, the spread of slavery, and the suppression of non-European cultures were integral to the nation's growth. Violence and coercion were justified in the name of destiny, yet they left scars that would shape future generations. Expansion revealed a pattern. Ambition and liberty coexisted uneasily, with opportunity for some built on suffering for others. By the mid-19th century, it was clear that the nation had expanded beyond the original vision of the founders. The United States stretched from the Mississippi River to the Pacific, yet the social and political fabric was fraying. Sectional conflict, moral contradictions, and questions of sovereignty foreshadowed a coming reckoning. Expansion brought territory and opportunity, but also conflict, inequality, and the realization that manifest destiny came with a heavy price. The story of westward expansion is therefore not only about geography, but about values, choices, and consequences. It illustrates the tension between ambition and ethics, growth and justice, freedom and oppression. Americans who moved west pursued opportunity, yet often at the expense of others' rights. The nation's destiny was realized through sacrifice, ingenuity, and courage, but also through displacement, conflict, and moral compromise. Expansion, conflict, and destiny are intertwined in the nation's history. The promise of the frontier inspired hope and possibility, while the methods used to achieve it revealed enduring contradictions. Manifest destiny was at once an ideology of progress and a justification for injustice, reflecting both the aspirations and the moral limitations of the young republic. By tracing the westward movement, one sees the nation grappling with fundamental questions. Who is included in the promise of freedom? Who is denied it? How can a society reconcile growth with justice? These questions, born on the frontier, would echo through the coming decades, fueling debate, struggle, and ultimately civil war. The story of expansion is a story of paradox, extraordinary opportunity built on extraordinary cost. The continent was transformed, but so too was the understanding of what freedom, justice, and destiny truly meant. The price of destiny was measured not only in land gained, but in lives displaced, cultures erased, and moral compromises made. The nation advanced geographically, but morally and politically it was forced to confront the consequences of its ambitions. In the end, expansion shaped the United States into a continental power, but also a nation divided. The pursuit of destiny brought wealth, innovation, and global influence, yet it demanded reflection, reckoning, and responsibility. The frontier was both a promise and a warning that growth without justice carries consequences, and that the cost of destiny is measured not only in maps, but in human lives.
Echoes of the past, how early struggles still shape America today. The story of America's early history, its colonial beginnings, revolutionary struggles, and westward expansion has left a deep and lasting imprint on the nation's identity. Centuries of triumph and tragedy, of ideals realized and promises deferred, continue to echo in contemporary life. From the founding principles of liberty to the unresolved injustices of slavery and displacement, the early struggles of the United States created both the foundation for democracy and the tensions that persist to this day. Colonial America was a place of contradictions. Settlers arrived seeking freedom from European control, yet they established systems of inequality that mirrored the hierarchies they left behind. Native peoples were displaced, enslaved Africans were forced into labor, and women were excluded from formal political power. The colonies' prosperity depended on exploitation as much as innovation, and the structures they built set patterns that would endure for generations. The echoes of these inequalities remain visible today in systemic disparities in wealth, education, and opportunity. The Revolution of 1776 represents another paradox. Americans rebelled against tyranny, proclaiming that all men are created equal, yet these ideals were initially applied to a limited segment of the population. Enslaved people remained in bondage, women could not vote, and Native Americans were largely ignored. Still, the Declaration of Independence provided a language of rights and liberty that would inspire countless movements for inclusion and justice in the centuries that followed. The Revolution did not instantly create equality, but it established principles against which injustice could be measured. Modern civil rights, women's suffrage, and advocacy for marginalized communities trace their roots directly to the revolutionary assertion of human rights. The Constitution, drafted in 1787, further exemplifies the dual legacy of early America. On one hand, it created a durable framework for governance, balancing state and federal authority and instituting checks and balances to prevent tyranny. On the other, compromises over slavery and representation entrenched inequality into law, sowing the seeds of future conflict. The fragility and flexibility of the Constitution remain instructive. It shows that democracy is both resilient and incomplete, requiring vigilance, adaptation, and engagement by each generation.
contemporary debates over voting rights, representation, and federal authority reflect the ongoing challenge of living up to the Constitution's ideals. Westward expansion, fueled by manifest destiny, produced both opportunity and suffering. Settlers gained land, resources, and prosperity, yet indigenous peoples were forcibly removed from their ancestral territories, and slavery expanded into new territories, deepening sectional divisions. These events reveal a recurring tension in American history. The pursuit of growth and progress often collided with justice and equity. The consequences of displacement, dispossession, and expansionist policies remain relevant today, informing discussions on indigenous sovereignty, land rights, and historical redress. The early United States also demonstrates the enduring influence of moral compromise in politics. Decisions made to secure unity, protect economic interests, or secure national survival often came at the expense of marginalized communities. Slavery, racial hierarchies, and gender exclusion were tolerated or institutionalized to preserve political and economic stability. The modern United States continues to wrestle with the consequences of these compromises, from debates over reparations to systemic racism and gender inequality. Understanding history requires acknowledging these difficult truths, not as accusations of the past, but as lessons for the present. Yet, alongside these contradictions, the early struggles of America offer profound inspiration. The ability of colonists to challenge imperial power, unite across regions, and experiment with self-governance demonstrates the transformative power of collective action. George Washington's leadership during the Revolutionary War, the compromises at the Constitutional Convention, and the persistence of reform movements all reveal that progress, though imperfect, is possible. Modern democracy, civic engagement, and activism are part of this inherited legacy. Citizens who demand accountability, advocate for equity, and participate in governance continue the work begun by the founders and revolutionaries. Education, law, and civic culture in the United States are deeply shaped by early struggles. The emphasis on literacy, debate, and civic responsibility traces back to Puritan communities and Enlightenment-inspired colonial thinkers. The ideals embedded in founding documents provide a framework for citizenship that encourages debate, dissent, and reform. Today's courts, legislative processes, and public institutions operate within a tradition that values both rule of law and the moral obligation to address injustice. The echoes of early America remind citizens that liberty is not merely inherited, it must be actively defended. The struggle for equality has been a continuous thread in American history. Enslaved people resisted oppression through rebellion, escape, and cultural preservation. Women advocated for recognition, suffrage, and rights. Native Americans fought to protect lands, culture, and sovereignty. These early struggles, though often unacknowledged at the time, laid the groundwork for modern movements seeking justice and inclusion. Today, advocacy for civil rights, gender equality, and indigenous sovereignty continues a narrative that began centuries ago. The past is not distant, it is a living influence shaping policy, law, and societal values. Moreover, the challenges of early America illustrate the consequences of moral and political decisions. Choices made to secure economic gain, political unity, or territorial expansion had human costs that resonated for generations. Modern America grapples with these legacies. Debates over racial justice, voting access, indigenous rights, and economic inequality reflect unresolved questions from the nation's formative years. Understanding these connections is essential for creating policies and institutions that honor the ideals of liberty and justice while acknowledging historical reality. The story of early America also highlights the importance of dialogue and compromise. The Constitutional Convention, the ratification debates, and negotiations over expansion and representation show that progress often requires balancing competing interests. Democracy, by nature, demands negotiation, patience, and moral courage. These lessons are highly relevant in contemporary politics, where polarization, partisanship, and social divisions challenge governance. The early republic demonstrates that engagement, even in difficult circumstances, is critical to sustaining a functioning democracy. In reflecting on the legacy of colonialism, revolution, and expansion, it becomes clear that the United States is a nation defined by both ideals and contradictions. Its founding principles, liberty, equality, and self-governance, coexist with histories of exclusion, exploitation, and moral compromise. Recognizing this duality is essential for understanding America today. It explains both the nation's remarkable achievements and its ongoing struggles. History is not merely a record of events, it is a lens for interpreting contemporary challenges and a guide for shaping a more just future. Echoes of the past remind modern Americans that democracy is not static. It is an ongoing experiment requiring vigilance, courage, and reflection. The same forces that shaped early America, conflict, compromise, innovation, and advocacy, continue to operate today. Citizens are called upon to confront inequality, defend rights, and participate in the political process. Lessons from history show that progress is possible, but it is neither guaranteed nor inevitable. It demands conscious effort. Ultimately, the story of early America underscores a central truth. The nation's achievements and its failings are inseparable. Liberty was won through revolution, yet denied to many. The Constitution created a framework for self-governance, yet embedded inequality. Expansion brought prosperity, yet inflicted profound suffering. Recognizing these complexities allows Americans to honor their history while addressing the consequences that endure. Echoes of the past are therefore not simply reminders of what has happened, they are calls to action. They ask citizens to uphold the promise of the nation, to confront injustice, and to ensure that liberty and equality are extended to all. The struggles of early America shaped institutions, culture,